What lessons can medicine learn by listening to those who live it every day? What happens when patients advocate not just for themselves, but for others like them? The stories that shape the future of healthcare are the stories we tell today. This is the Patient Perspectives Podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Patient Perspectives Podcast. I'm Lauren Scholler, and today I'm joined by Heather McBride, who was treated for congenital hip dislocation as a baby, and as a teen she began to experience mysterious symptoms that evolved and progressed into adulthood, but could not be explained, understood, or successfully treated by doctors. She went on to receive a number of significant medical diagnoses in her mid-30s as a result of the advocacy and outreach of fellow chronic illness patients on social media. She's currently in the midst of a series of major orthopedic surgeries, and she uses social media now as a platform for her own outreach to help other patients get connected with the care they need. Heather is an education specialist in Connecticut with her husband, and in her free time, she loves doing aerial arts. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. Can you start by sharing about yourself, anything related to your diagnoses, experiences as a patient professionally, or background that would be important for listeners to know?
As you mentioned at the beginning, my story kind of starts way back when I was an infant. I was just a few months old, and my mom noticed some asymmetries with my legs, and she felt concerned. So she brought me in to see a doctor, but that first doctor didn't really see anything wrong and kind of reassured her that everything was okay. But she wasn't really settled with that. So she ended up seeking a second opinion, and that opinion led to a diagnosis of left hip dislocation. So when I was 6 months old, I ended up in the hospital. I spent 2 weeks with my legs up in traction. And at the end of that time, I had open reduction surgery to repair and put the hip back in the socket. And I emerged from that surgery in a spica cast, which is a cast that goes from kind of like your underarms all the way down to your ankles. And it keeps your hips in like sort of an optimal position for trying to grow a socket properly. So I was in the cast for 6 months. And then when the cast came off, I wore a brace full-time, fading to nights only until I was around like 2 years old. So that was kind of like, we thought that was the end of the story, like orthopedically speaking, at least, that treatment would buy me almost 35 years of sort of normalcy. I got to go, like, to grow up running around the playground, and I did gymnastics, I rode horses. I was like doing like Richard Simmons, like sweating to the oldies with my best friend to work out. And like, I did all this stuff. I went to college and grad school. I launched my career. I got married and settled down in our forever home. And, like I just sort of got to enjoy all of that before I needed to start dealing with surgeries again. So I have a lot of gratitude for that. And then, kind of going back a little bit, though, in other ways, my health was a bit of a struggle for a number of years in terms of other symptoms. So around my mid-teens, I started dealing with mystery symptoms that became progressively worse. Into my 20s and my early 30s, I was having like severe itching and rashes, food intolerances. I ended up with adult onset asthma. I had insomnia as well, dizzy spells, pelvic pain, just a whole bunch of stuff. So, it was starting to kind of snowball and become overwhelming. And there wasn't really anything that the doctors were able to tell me about what was going on and kind of help me with that. So I kind of just started to deal with it myself and just figure out how I could, adjust my lifestyle. And I did have some improvement in my symptoms, but didn't really like fully resolve anything ever. And so fast forward, I guess, to April 2021, I was 35 at the time. I was visiting my parents in Florida, and I just went on a walk with my mom. I came back from the walk limping due to some sudden onset left hip pain. Like the front of my hip was, it felt like strained. So I just was like, oh, that's weird. I'll just rest it. And so for the next several months, I would rest it, it would feel better. And as soon as I would return to normal activities, the pain would come back. And so it ended up like it pushed it much longer than I probably should have. And finally, around like Thanksgiving time, I was working in the kitchen and had this severe burning, shooting pain that was sort of like the max tolerable that I could endure before I could no longer function. And so I kind of decided at that point, like, okay, I really need to take this seriously and get some help. Um, so I started physical therapy. A short time after that, I was able to get a referral. I did get some relief from that, but while it helped, it didn't really resolve the issue completely. So my PT became suspicious and ended up referring me to ortho. And from there, I was formally diagnosed with significant bilateral hip dysplasia in March and was referred to a PAO surgeon in April. And we ended up agreeing to move forward with surgery. And so I at some point prior to surgery posted on my social media just to sort of update my friends and family about what was going on with me. And I had a friend with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome comment on that post, oh, I'm assuming you've already ruled out a connective tissue disorder. And I was like, oh no, I definitely don't have that. It's like, I had no idea what that was, but I had never been told that I had an issue. And so she kind of asked me some questions. We had a back and forth about it. And by the end of that conversation, she said, well, like, I really would strongly suggest you go see my geneticist, and here's their contact information. And so I ended up calling and I kind of got in on a fluke cancellation. And about 2 months before my first PAO surgery on my left hip, I was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I had sort of barely wrapped my head around that diagnosis when I had my first hip surgery, which was very painful and difficult recovery. And I healed very slowly and had some complications, but it was ultimately successful. And later on that fall, I would kind of go on to complete the trifecta of being diagnosed with POTS and MCAS along with it, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and mast cell activation syndrome. And those two kind of go along with EDS a lot of the time. So I was able to get myself connected with all of the right medical care, properly medicated, and then went on to have a PAO on my right hip in June 2023. I did have some complications and slow healing with that, but like overall things went a whole lot better because of the protocols that we had in place for my other disorders. And so that brings me to last March, April timeframe. I thought I had made it. I was done with my hip surgeries. Everything was looking good. My knees have sort of always been bad, but it's been like to a level that was livable. I could just kind of like manage around them. But all of a sudden, they started to take a very sharp downhill turn. Another long story short, I was eventually in September formally diagnosed with a condition called miserable malalignment syndrome. And so now here I am, February 2025. I'm waiting on corrective surgery to fix my miserable malalignment syndrome, which involves breaking and resetting the femurs and tibias on both of my legs, one leg at a time, but need to realign everything properly. So I have my right leg scheduled for March and my left leg scheduled for July. So yeah, that's sort of, that's not a brief overview. It was a lengthy one, but it's been just a long and winding road. There's a lot more details that I could fill in, but this is sort of like the main storyline of everything and how I found myself age 39 as a medically complex patient in the middle of this epic saga.
That is a long journey for sure. And you mentioned your social media, which is how I had connected with you in the midst of our hip journeys. I had turned to social media myself to try to connect and find support from other patients who were going through it. And so I'd love to hear what motivated you to share your story more on social media. You mentioned it was initially to update friends and family, but if that kind of grew from there, and what can providers and patients learn from your story?
It's funny because I already had social media accounts, like personal social media accounts, and that's where I kind of initially updated people. But at some point in the lead up to my first PAO on my hip, I ended up deciding to create a dedicated social media account for my hip journey. And the reason for this was because I wanted to like keep people updated and kind of share with them what was going on, but also kind of like give them the option to not tune into that if they weren't interested in like seeing surgical stuff on Instagram or whatever. But what I kind of ended up posting on there and like curating this sort of information about what my journey was, the motivation behind that was because in the lead up to my first PAO, the anxiety and fear of the unknown was so overwhelming for me that I felt like I was about to lose my mind. Like I've never experienced anxiety to that intensity before. It was like almost like I could hardly function at times, because for me, what is scary is the unknown. Like pain sometimes, like it's scary in a certain way, but I can deal with physical pain, but I have a really hard time dealing with things that I can't understand or can't know about, or something that I know is going to happen to me and I don't know what to expect. And so I was sort of like feverishly searching online on social media, asking questions on Facebook, and just trying to find any information that I could to give me an idea of what to expect. And so what I ended up creating was the account that I wish that I had been able to refer to when it was me in that position. And I just wanted to create that for people who had that like compulsive need, like I had, to understand what to expect and be prepared. Even if it was like, you know, maybe for some people it would be too much information and it would scare them off. I think that there's a portion of the population who's like me, where it's like there's no such thing as too much information. There's only a such thing as too little understanding, and not sort of too much mystery, I guess. So yeah, I ended up, it's become a rather long story on that social media account, and now I'm gonna be posting about these upcoming surgeries. But I just think it's, at the end of the day, I also think it's important for those of us with maybe some more uncommon or less visible chronic illnesses or disabilities to be visible on there and just share what our experiences are like. I think representation matters too. So the more we see and connect with other people who are going through things like what we're going through, the more, the less isolated we feel.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that like social peer support aspect of going through surgeries and recovering and also just navigating unknown territory, having the social support of people who understand that and have been through it is incredibly important. And I think that's a piece that was, missing for many years just because social media wasn't a big thing. And the way that social media has grown and people have been able to find voices through advocating and just sharing their story online. And I just love the way that you addressed kind of that need within yourself to say, like, you wouldn't want other people to experience it the way that you did, where you're kind of left on your own. And so to take that need and address it through your own personal experiences and story, I think that's really admirable.
It helps me too. I feel like, like I enjoy helping others, and, like kind of being that like account that I wished I had when I was in their shoes. But I think it also like maybe selfishly helps me a little bit too, because it makes me feel like there's a purpose for me going through all of this stuff. Like if I can help others, then I can create meaning out of it. And that means that like it can't have been a bad thing, right? Like it was meant I was meant to help people with it.
I can relate to that for sure. And I also find that it's kind of a way of coping for me, being able to write and express it and knowing that there are people on the other end who know what you're going through. And so for me, it's also kind of it's a coping mechanism to like write and to share in that way. But also, again, if you can help even just one person, that's an amazing thing, and you can really connect with wonderful people. One aspect of what you were talking about earlier, where you had this surgery when you were a baby, and then you were left with the thought that you were going to be, that was going to kind of be it for however long. And then in your
Yeah.
teens, you started noticing mysterious symptoms. And then from there, it's kind of turned into a long string of surgeries and medical diagnoses and just a really unexpected situation from what you were told to expect as a kid. And to me, that feels like it must have been very emotionally overwhelming and tiring. And I know that making decisions about surgery and treatment can be daunting, especially when it's very unexpected. So, how did you approach making these decisions, and what do you wish providers understood about that emotional side of the decision-making process?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I feel like that's a really good question. I feel like I've had to make decisions about surgery in multiple phases. Like I had to make my decision about the hip surgery, and that felt like a sort of somewhat different process than the decision to have the leg surgeries and kind of how like just the different ways that those uh, conversations unfolded. I think if I had to boil it down to just like two things, for me, my approach comes down to two factors, and it is A, does the treatment address the root of the issue? Like for me, I think, and I think everybody's different, right? Like some people are really not interested in having these major surgeries and they kind of want to bide their time, like for example, with PAOs, a lot of people are much more, um, they find the idea of total hip replacement much more appealing than PAO. And so their option is to sort of bide their time until they need a THR. But for me, I think differently and think like, what's the point of putting myself through something if I can just not, if I can just get to the root of the problem first. And so, that was sort of my, that's A. Does this treatment affect the root of the issue? And then B, the sort of, I like to sort of run every scenario, um, from every choice down to the end of the road. Like if I do the surgery, what does that look like? If I don't do the surgery, what does that look like? I play out the scenarios and I consider it through the lens of regret because I think no matter what path you take, you can experience regret. And I guess it kind of came down to, am I going to, which one will I regret more? Having the surgery or not having the surgery? And I think, like I, not in like a reckless way, I guess, because I do make informed choices and I'm very, like I do a great deal of research before I make a decision, but at the same time, I do kind of have this quote from, I believe it's attributed to Lucille Ball, who I love, and it says it's something along the lines of, "I'd rather regret the things I did than the things I didn't do." And so that, I mean, that's not necessarily like how you make a decision around surgery, but like I guess for me it was like, do I want to look at this and you know and choose not to have the PAO surgery and later on have to live with that what if, and like regret not trying it versus having the PAO surgery if things didn't go well and I, ended up needing a total hip replacement, which like I probably still will need a THR down the road, but at least I could say I did everything to try to prolong the survival of my native hip. And, you know, I felt like I was able to turn every stone over. So yeah, I think those are the two things that it came down to for me. I feel like, and then in terms of, the other part of your question with providers, I feel like I think there's a few things that I would love providers to understand better. I think, they're often kind of disconnected from the like human experience of all of this, just because, and that like not through any fault of their own, but just the perspective that they have based on the times when they're interacting with you and the things that they see versus the things that they don't see. I think it just naturally creates a scenario where they have a certain perspective, but I wish that they understood the value of connection more and tried to like encourage patients to seek out these support groups and find other people online, or like I just wish that there was a better system for that. I don't know how that would look like, but in an ideal world, because I think fear is so intense and it's very isolating. And for me, like you mentioned it before, just like being having the opportunity to be visible in the social media sphere and connect with other patients, who are kind of going through the same thing. This has really been my lifeline in all of this. And I really don't know how I would be surviving as well as I am right now if I didn't have the opportunity to do that. Like if I were the only one in my life who was experiencing all of this, it would kind of be crazy making, I think.
One thing that I'm impressed about with the hip preservation program that we went through was that they have a program where they connect patients who are undergoing this PAO surgery. They connect them preoperatively so that they kind of have a buddy to rely on and to look to for support throughout their surgery and recovery. And I think if other hip preservation programs or there's certainly a need for that in other specialties as well and other types of surgeries. I think if hospitals were able to create something like that, because that social support, like we've said so many times, is so important and it can make patients feel less alone and just easier to navigate what it looks like to recover from a surgery like this at home, because that's something that you're not prepared for by your medical teams, because that information best comes from someone who has been through it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that I was at least impressed with, that some departments and programs have recognized that need and they're trying to build these opportunities for patients to connect better with other patients.
Yep. One of the other patients that I had kind of connected with on social media around the time of my first PAO, her surgeon actually was in a different part of the United States, but her surgeon kind of created a meetup and had invited all of her patients to, like adult patients specifically, to meet up at like a restaurant or a bar, and she had like reserved some space. And it just like you know, they had taken pictures together and just had like the best time, and they're all like sort of in different stages of healing and recovery, um and it just was like there really is nothing like just getting in a room with a whole bunch of people that you don't have to explain anything to. Like you just automatically, everybody there understands exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. I just thought that was really cool. I'm like, yeah, I think more of this needs to happen somehow.
I agree. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, with a lot of these surgeries that you've had, they're very specialized surgeries, like a periacetabular osteotomy. You also mentioned femoral osteotomies, these major reconstructive surgeries. And I think when you're going through a surgery like that that requires a very specialized team, finding the right surgeon and the right care team is critical, not only to ensure that you're receiving the appropriate expertise, but also just to know that you're comfortable with your surgeon and your care team. So, what advice would you give to other patients about identifying providers who respect and include them in their care decisions?
That's a really important question because I think like getting a diagnosis like this can be so overwhelming. It can be really hard to think rationally at that point, and there's like so many emotions swirling around. So, yeah, like navigating the choice of surgeon is huge too, because there's a lot of surgeons out there who are really, really good at what they do, but I also feel like it's equally important that you have to like you have to feel comfortable with them. Like something has to click, and somebody can be a really good surgeon, but you could also just not connect with them, and that's okay. um, so I think some pieces of advice that I would give would be bring a trusted friend with you. I think specifically somebody, and this is for adults specifically, obviously, but or even maybe like the parent of a child who's getting these diagnoses, just to have somebody there with you who's like on your side. They're close enough to you to care about you, but they're not too close, like, like a parent or like a close family member, because like their judgment could be obscured by sort of their own worries. Um, but yeah, I think I have had a friend who's accompanied me to a number of my like sort of big appointments where I felt like there was a possibility that I could become really overwhelmed, and was really, really helpful afterwards to like debrief with that person and sort of like process some of my thoughts and feelings about it, because some, like the appointments that she's been to, some of them have gone really well, but I still needed to process because I was really overwhelmed and emotional about the whole thing. And so I was like, well, I don't know if I'm like feeling this way because the appointment didn't go well or because I'm just like really upset about this situation. And so having somebody who could like talk me through all of that and help me sort things out was helpful. And then there were other times when the appointment maybe like really didn't go well, but it's confusing because a lot of the time you're meeting with somebody who's they're really good at what they do, that they've helped a lot of people, but it just wasn't a match. And I think like for me especially, I tend to be really quick to gaslight myself and just say like, oh, like it must have been me, like maybe I'm the problem, it can't have been that person. And so there were a lot of different reasons why having another person there with me was very valuable, and so I recommend that like to everybody. And like I said, keep in mind too, it's not always going to be a match, and it's okay to have permission to seek multiple opinions and to go with your gut even if something looks really good on paper. If you just don't feel right, like it's okay to find somebody else. And I also would caution people to be careful about those situations where if you're trying to ask questions, or if you're like, if you're wanting to like get answers to things and you're feeling like you're being rushed, or you're feeling like you're with somebody who just sort of has somewhere else to be, or like has their own like strong opinions. I think that that's something to pay attention to as well, because really like you're a partner in this decision making and you need to be informed. And I think people don't always feel like they can assert themselves in those situations. But at the end of the day, it's your body and it's your right to ask questions and to get those questions answered. And I think like that's what builds trust, and the trust with your surgeon is essential. And if somebody violates your trust by trying to brush you off, or not giving you the time that you need to get your questions answered and to feel at peace with it, or even like offering up your options in an unbiased way and just helping you talk through it in a logical, rational way, like it's okay to move on if that doesn't go well.
That's great advice, and especially emphasizing that as a patient, you are a partner with your medical team. That's something that I feel strongly is that it should be a patient-provider partnership, and that means that you are working as a team and you're understanding each other, that the doctor is understanding your goals and your values as a patient and using that to help to inform treatment and using it in decision making. And if a provider ever rushes you in an appointment and tries to rush that decision making process, I think that can be really detrimental to being informed as a patient. And so finding those doctors who allow you to take the time to ask the questions, take the time to, as you said earlier, even just processing the information that you hear and in an appointment is it is like such an important thing to be able to have that space to either process it in the moment or to come back at another appointment and say, I thought about this and I have additional questions, or like it has made me think about X, Y, and Z, and having a doctor or a provider who like is okay with that, and that it takes time to process these big decisions, and it really it shouldn't you shouldn't be expected to make a major decision right then.
Yes.
You should be allowed the space to like go home, think about it, maybe do some extra searching online to be comfortable with that, and then go back and perhaps make the decision at a later time, because it's so overwhelming to be deciding on major life-changing surgeries in one appointment or even two appointments.
Yep, I totally agree.
One thing about your story that I think is interesting is how you kind of have multiple major diagnoses. And so I was wondering if having these multiple diagnoses, if you feel like that complicates getting new and accurate diagnoses, and how have you navigated this, and what can doctors know and do for patients with multiple diagnoses?
Yeah, I 100% think that having multiple diagnoses complicates matters and can make it harder to get the problem, like the true problem, identified. So the thing, like the example of this in my instance that I feel like sticks out to me is that with my miserable malalignment syndrome, I've had bad knees for like that's pretty much just been a constant in my life that like, oh, we just have bad knees. Um, it runs in the family. We all just thought, oh, we just have bad knees. Like, we all have EDS. And I suspect that many of us also have some of these rotational issues with our legs too, to account for it. But it was just sort of like, you know, something that we just accepted. And then once I got diagnosed with EDS and started having these PAO surgeries, I started to become more aggressively concerned about my knees. I kind of knew during my first PAO recovery that something was kind of more seriously wrong because when you have the PAOs, your hip is broken. Like you can't put weight on it for a number of weeks. And so it's hard to, like you have to be careful doing certain things like going up and down the stairs, for example. Like they teach you how to do that in physical therapy before you leave the hospital. And so the way you kind of do it, the way you're supposed to do it, going down the stairs is you kind of like, you're keeping your weight on your non-operative leg and you put the crutches on the step below you, which requires you to kind of crouch and squat a little bit on your non-operative leg. And then kind of put your operative foot on the step and just like touch it down, but not put weight through it and shift your weight onto the crutches so that you can move your non-operated foot down to the next step. So in this process, there are points in time when your non-operated leg is in a bent position while you're crouching down, moving to the next step, and your bent leg is holding the majority of your weight. And I would routinely fear that I was going to fall down the stairs because my right knee was so painful and so unstable, and it felt like it was like just this close to giving out on me on the steps. And I said, this is not right. And so I started to try to seek some help with my knees. What's going on? Is there anything that can be done? I wasn't like looking for more surgery, but I needed something to stop me from falling down the stairs with a broken hip. And whenever you go to ortho for a complaint, like usually they'll take x-rays before your appointment. And so I had a lot of x-rays done on my knees, and the ortho would just say like, well, your x-rays look pretty normal. There were some things like I have patella alta, so my patella is a little bit too high on my knee. And they're like, like I see like there's a a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but overall your x-rays are not that bad and everything looks really good. And so, you just need to strengthen. And a lot of it was sort of like blamed on my EDS. My kneecaps are super duper loose. You can actually like take my kneecap and like just wiggle it back and forth across my knee to the point of essentially like dislocating it completely, just because the EDS causes a lot of tissue laxity. And so they would just sort of say like, look, your vastus medialis is so weak, your leg is shaking when you try to hold it up, and I could wiggle your kneecap around. And so this is really just an EDS issue. You need to go to PT and you need to strengthen your quad muscles better. So, it was just kind of a foregone conclusion, like, oh, this problem is inoperable. It's just because of your EDS. And that ended up being like the scapegoat for a while. And I kind of ended up I essentially had to do my own research to observe like the appearance of my legs and do a lot of like, my own looking around online. And I ended up self-diagnosing with miserable malalignment syndrome. And then I had to work backwards and find a surgeon who could confirm the diagnosis and recommend surgery. But yeah, it was just when I ended up getting taken a bit more seriously finally, and they did CT scans on my knees. When you look at the cross section of the knee where the patella is, you can just see like that my femurs are super rotated inwards, and the patellas are like subluxed out of the groove of the, it's called the trochlea, the groove at the bottom of your femur where your patella is supposed to glide over it. Both of my patellas just completely out of the groove when my leg is straight. But the issue is like when you get x-rays done of your knees, they do those images with your knees bent. And so you can't see, like when my knee bends, the patella re-engages with the trochlea. And so you couldn't see the issue, but nobody took it a step further. Everybody just sort of looked at my x-rays, said, oh, these look pretty normal. You have EDS. It just must be EDS. Your EDS knees are just a problem. And nobody took it a step further to, seek out additional imaging. And I even had when I had MRIs done, the MRI tech, when I came out of the MRI machine, she was like, so did you have like an injury to your knee? And I was like, no, like this is just, I've never injured my knee. This is just how they are. And she's like, she couldn't believe, she's like, wait, really? You never injured, you didn't do anything to your knee? And I'm like, no, why? She's like, doesn't, like, your patella is not on the right spot. Like, she could tell right away that something wasn't right, just by doing a different image than the x-ray. So anyway, I feel like I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole with all of this, but I just feel like with the EDS, I had this underlying structural issue with the miserable malalignment syndrome, but there wasn't that impetus to do a deeper dive. Like, oh, okay, well, we see the x-ray. What we're seeing here doesn't account for the pain you're experiencing. Let's do another type of imaging to see what it could be. It just sort of stopped there, and my EDS became the scapegoat on that. So, eventually, like I did get connected with the right care, but it was like I had to, like I said, I kind of had to work backwards and do my own research, like a massive amounts of my own research, and find a surgeon who could confirm that diagnosis and then recommend a treatment plan. And then even still, what's kind of like, I guess, frustrating a little bit is that I've met with resistance while awaiting these rotation surgeries. I have my formal diagnosis of miserable malalignment syndrome, but everybody sees things through their own lens, right? And I love all of my providers. I have multiple providers who care for my EDS related needs, but not like a number of them, since my diagnosis with MMS and the surgical plan that was developed out of that, a number of these EDS providers have actually tried to discourage me from getting the surgeries because they don't understand MMS, they understand EDS, and they kind of know how risky ortho surgeries can be for us. And, a lot of times these are soft tissue repairs that are being done, and that's often not the wisest thing with EDS. And so I really, really appreciate that they are trying to look out for me, in the spirit of sort of that line of questioning. But all that to say, like, it would just be very, very easy for me to be led down the wrong path if I weren't as informed as I am. And so I had to become an expert in my own condition to even get the proper diagnosis and get a plan, like going back to what I said earlier, like I'm looking for the true fix. The true fix is like these leg derotations, and I had to make that happen myself. And I also need to be informed enough to be able to stand up to some pressure from well-meaning providers who are questioning if this surgery is the right move for me. So at the end of the day, in answer to your question, I think what I would love to see, I guess, more of from providers is to get a bit more curious, like in all respects, like if your patient is coming to you and they're having pain, and you do one type of diagnostic test or imaging that doesn't explain the pain or doesn't substantiate the complaints, like don't find the nearest scapegoat. Just keep digging and try to help that patient get to the bottom of what's going on. And and then if you have a patient who comes to you and says, oh, I'm looking to do this treatment, or I'm looking to to do this surgery or whatever it is, instead of saying, oh, I don't think you should do that, ask questions like, how did you come to that decision? Because a lot of the things that they're saying are trying conservative treatments. Well, at this point, I've been in physical therapy for over 3 years continuously, and my condition is just getting worse. And I've tried injections, and I've tried acupuncture, and I've tried all like manual manipulations. I've tried it all, and I'm not getting any relief. And I've also done the research. Like, I've read the papers, I've read the studies, and I know that miserable malalignment syndrome cannot be treated conservatively. So I've done all of this and I've taught myself about it. And I just wish that my providers would have asked me to share what I had learned and what I knew and how that informed my decision making rather and like have a conversation about it so that to help them understand better rather than sort of like jumping to the conclusion that I was being hasty in my decision making when it was really quite the opposite.
You said that so well, especially for those of us with underlying syndromes. I think it's easy for doctors to attribute symptoms or complaints to that underlying syndrome rather than taking those next steps. And I like the way you said it, for them to be more curious rather than easily attributing it to, well, you have this underlying syndrome that can cause multisystemic issues, and so it must be that.
Yeah,
But there is oftentimes more layers that go into that, and it can also be easy when patients are faced with those doctors who don't necessarily take those extra steps and get that extra imaging. It can be easy for patients to fall into gaslighting themselves, like you said, to say,
yeah,
well, maybe this isn't as bad as I am feeling like it is, or maybe it is just something that I need to resign to the fact that it's related to my EDS or my syndrome, whatever the case may be, when really there is more of a deeper cause that can be treated and addressed.
yeah. Yep. And I totally recognize too from the provider side of things, like there's never any ill intent. Like I hope I don't come off as like saying that because I think they're genuinely looking out for your best interests and people don't want to do unnecessary interventions. And I also think like that part of this, especially in the US here, like, insurance approvals roll into that. And like there's a lot. And doctors have huge caseloads often and not very much time to spend with each patient. So I know that there's a lot of barriers to all of this too. And it's not an easy solution to just say like, oh, just do this differently. Um, but yeah, I think it like having conversations about it is at least a good starting point to start to say like, here are the issues and how can we do better?
Definitely. Now, with your long journey as a patient, I would love to hear what patient-centered care means to you and ways that you've experienced it, ways that you haven't in your own care, and how have you had to advocate for yourself in a medical setting?
Yeah. So this is the question that I'm like, oh my gosh, now here are like a bunch of stories flooding to my head. I've had a lot of um, learning experiences, I guess, navigating the system with my conditions, especially because a lot of them went undiagnosed for so long too. But okay, I'll kind of take your question in two parts. So the first part was, what does patient-centered care mean to me? I think like I alluded to this a little bit earlier too, where I just think patient-centered care means that the patient's voice is equally valuable in the conversation. I think it's important to consider the patient's goals and for the provider to understand what those goals are and to support them. I also think on the patient side of things, like the patient is informed about their care and that they have an equal stake in the decision making rather than just sort of being told, oh, this is what's best for you, and sort of blindly going into something that can be very life changing and really not understanding it or even like buying into it fully, but just feeling like, oh, this is what my surgeon told me I had to do. So I think there needs to be a lot more like back and forth conversation and shared ownership in that process. Of course, the providers too, like, I think at the end of the day, the providers are the experts in the subject area. And that's why the patient is going to them. And it's not like, the patient is going to know more about the subject area than the provider, but the patient is the expert in their own body. And they are the ones who know what they're feeling and what they're experiencing too. So I think that kind of you need to put those two things together, that subject matter expertise, but also that true patient experience and like, what is that patient's life like? What kind of lifestyle do they want to have? What like fitness goals do they have, or whatever? That all needs to be a part of that conversation. And like I was saying earlier, some people are not interested in putting themselves through PAO and they just want a band-aid, until they get to THR. And a PAO surgeon may feel like, wow, this is an ideal candidate. I know I could go in there and I could fix their hip and make it look great. But at the end of the day, if that's not what the patient wants, then like what's on paper really isn't relevant. And you just kind of need to meet the patient where they're at, hear them, understand them, and you know, like what can we do together to make things better in a way that feels right for you. And then in terms of like how I've experienced it personally, I feel like I said, I think this is the part of the question where I'm going to struggle to even like pick, I guess, like one single experience to highlight everything because I've had, especially in the last 5 years, a lot of experiences with a lot of different providers, and some of them have just been like really, really good, and some of them have been really, really bad. I guess the best example that jumps to mind is sort of the relationship that I have with one of my providers locally, who is somebody that I trust a great deal, and I always feel super understood by this person and validated and supported. I've been seeing this person for about a year and a half now on a monthly basis. He's sort of watched me go through my second PAO recovery, and he's watched me go through some other subsequent surgeries after that. And we've talked about my knees because it's sort of in that time my knees have been getting worse too. And he's always taken that very seriously as well. And, he even like at one point did like an ultrasound, and he'll kind of poke around my knees. Does this hurt? Does this hurt? I think this is what's going on. So I always feel really heard by him. But, there was one appointment that we had probably in the fall sometime. And this is somebody who, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, one of my very EDS informed providers who expressed concern. And when I told him that I had found a surgeon and I was going to be pursuing more osteotomy surgeries, the reaction was, I don't want to like mischaracterize it as like a lot, like I guess the way that I interpreted the reaction, even if it wasn't his intention, was sort of alarm. And I just the way that he responded, I felt myself shut down almost immediately in that appointment, and kind of, like I really don't like conflict. I'm very averse to conflict. And so when that situation sort of happens where somebody like challenges me or asks me questions, and I feel, especially in this area where it's like something that's been like a concern that I've been fighting to get heard on for so long, it really sort of like triggered sort of a major stress response for me. And I just remember in that appointment just feeling like, oh no, I want to cry. I need to like put this facade up. And I did my whole like pleasant facade, and I just tried to like get through the appointment. But I felt, even if it wasn't his intention, I felt like I was maybe acting too hastily, or that I perceived that he perceived me that way, I guess. That I was like jumping into a surgery that I didn't really need, and I was maybe like, being a little bit crazy. Like, I just had these PAO surgeries, and wasn't that enough? Like, why do you need to go searching for more problems and have more major surgeries? Like, that's kind of what I was hearing. Again, I think I was maybe hearing some things that he wasn't saying necessarily, but just his reaction like really surprised me and upset me. And it took me a while to process. And this is the other thing I'm not sure that all providers necessarily recognize, that when we have a bad experience, a lot of times it's like an ordeal. Like, I got home and I had to process, and it's like I almost like stopped being able to function, and just like, it's like you're a little bit paralyzed because you're just sort of overwhelmed with some, like, a lot of like emotion and confusion and like a lot of sort of things going on in your internal world that you need to now process, because everything just got really unsettled just from one sort of innocent interaction. And so I thought about it for a while, and kind of what happened, what went wrong in that interaction, because this is somebody whose care I really, really value, and who, like, I value this person as a human. Like, I think they're a really good person, and I don't think that they meant to upset me at all. And so my next appointment, I went in, it was, like, I see him monthly. And so I went in there, and before we kind of got started, I asked him, oh, can I set the record straight on my knees? Because I think the thing was like that I realized was I started seeing him after my like right after my second PAO, and he was missing some of that context that I have been struggling with my knees for a very, very long time, for longer than I was struggling with my hips, to be honest. And I think he was missing that context. And I was like, I think this is why. I think this is why he thinks that I'm being hasty because he doesn't know how long I've been dealing with this and how many solutions I've tried. And so I asked him, like, can I set the record straight on my knees? And he was like, of course. And I started talking, and I think he could sense right away that I had rehearsed this in my head a number of times before this appointment, and I was like really trying to say something here. And just the way that he responded was so supportive and meaningful for me. He literally, like, he's without breaking eye contact, he was looking at me like very like intently, and he grabs like a rolling stool and he pulls it over and he sits down, and he just sat there, and he just listened. And I had his full undivided attention. And after I sort of said everything that I needed to say, he looked at me and he said, I understand, I believe you, and I support you. And it was just like, oh, and he kind of clarified. He was like, I was intending to kind of get this across, or like however, whatever he said. It was like we just had that kind of like conversation where it was like, this is where I'm coming from, and this is where I'm coming from. But he listened, and he, like, acknowledged what I needed him to acknowledge, and it was like everything was fine. Like it wasn't like a unfixable problem or anything. It was like just sort of like the perfect communication around that situation. And I actually feel like having that interaction helped me develop like a deeper trust in him, because at the end of the day, I know that he's looking out for my best interests, and and trying to advocate for me and make sure that I don't, like, cause any harm to myself. But he also doesn't see the full picture of my life. He sees a snapshot of me every like 4 to 6 weeks. And so it's important for me to feel like I can share with him about what's going on all the time that I'm not with him, and how I'm feeling and how I'm functioning. And he showed me on that day that he can listen and take that in, which is not something that every provider does, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And I loved hearing that he said that he believed you and acknowledged that, because especially in patients with chronic pains, it can be really hard to feel like, I guess it can be hard to feel believed, right? And for providers to take that time to listen and validate your, either whether it's your pain, your, other symptoms, or just your situation as a whole, is really crucial for establishing that trust, like you said. So I'm glad that you were able to advocate for yourself in that way, and that you were comfortable enough to take that other interaction and mention it again at a later appointment and say, I think we had kind of a disconnect, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, and that he was receptive to that as well, because that's what that partnership is about. He was willing to learn from the prior interaction and take in how you felt about it and say, like you said, he was never ill-intentioned, but it just came off in a way that felt uncomfortable to you. And I can totally agree that when you have those interactions with doctors, it can feel paralyzing. And it's like that, at least for me, the rest of the time in between that appointment and when I saw him next, I would be constantly thinking about that. And it's hard to feel misunderstood. So it's great that you were able to advocate for yourself in that way, and to really, that was able to be an opportunity to establish more trust with him going forward. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and that thing that you said too about just like being believed, that is such a huge thing. And I think that for those of us living with chronic conditions, especially ones that are late diagnosed or invisible, or whatever, like where it feels a lot of time like you need to sort of like prove yourself, and prove that you really do need and deserve care. And I had an experience with the first surgeon that I saw for my knees and my miserable malalignment. that was really bad. It was a really upsetting appointment, and he dismissed the issue and kind of just like sent me off to sports medicine. But the more harmful part of that appointment out of everything was that he actually repeatedly questioned the validity of my EDS diagnosis. For whatever reason, he just very clearly did not think that I was truly, that I truly had EDS. And he kind of asked me to like perform several movements to prove my hypermobility, and he shortchanged my range of motion. It was just like he was clearly he had the opinion in his mind that he knew exactly what was going on with me, and he was like going to prove it, and he actually wrote in the written report after that appointment, that my EDS diagnosis was not definitive, which was a huge overstep because yes, it is definitive. But I was thinking about it because it's like that type of stuff really shakes you up, because I think about when I first got my EDS diagnosis, I spent legitimately months afterwards questioning, and just thinking like, am I just being dramatic? Like I had literally gone to one of the most well-known connective tissue geneticists on the Eastern Seaboard, and he diagnosed me with EDS, and I have a letter proving that diagnosis. And even still, I was like, wow, I must have put on a really great performance to convince this guy that there was something wrong with me when there's not. And the reality is, I, at that appointment when I got my EDS diagnosis, I underreported my symptoms so substantially that he like kind of jokingly called me Miss Denial, because he was so certain looking at me that I had a connective tissue disorder. And he's like, there's no way that you don't experience these symptoms. Like you essentially, like I had always lived with them, and most of my family members also have lived with these symptoms. And so these were all things that we thought were normal. And so I underreported them. I was like, no, that's not really a problem for me. And so he, like I was saying, like for weeks after that appointment, I was like, wow, I must have put on a really good show. But the reality was he diagnosed me in spite of me underreporting my symptoms, because in hindsight, I really did underreport my symptoms, and I am much more aware of what I'm feeling now and more tuned into to my experience. But then, years later, still going to this doctor and having him like suggest that my diagnosis wasn't valid, it like shook the foundation, because it triggered that little part inside of me with the imposter syndrome. Like, wow, I must be putting on a really convincing show just to try to get all this attention. Like it really can mess with your head. And at the end of the day, like I would love to not have EDS, in a lot of ways, I would love to not have to deal with the things that I deal with, but that's not reality.
That brought up a really interesting point about when I had a tethered spinal cord, and I had gone to this doctor who I was told that they were going to be the one to be, back when my symptoms were mysterious and we didn't know what was going on. I was referred to this doctor who I was told she was going to be able to figure out what was going on and she was going to help me. And so I had a lot of hope in that, all while I was dealing with very debilitating and disabling symptoms. And so I went to this appointment, and it was such an unfortunate appointment because she said that there really was nothing wrong and I just needed more supportive shoes and physical therapy. And so in the midst of that, again, kind of like you were saying, I took a few days and I was like, are my symptoms really like as disabling as they feel? Like, am I being dramatic?
Yeah.
Um, all while both you and I have experienced very real medical experiences over the years, and we know our bodies well, we know when something isn't right. And so when I finally went to the orthopedic surgeon who ended up diagnosing me with a tethered spinal cord, I took some time afterwards. And when I saw the neurosurgeon, and he also had confirmed it, and he was like, really recommended spinal cord detethering, I was like, wow, did I did I like put on did I do something where I like swayed them to come to this conclusion? And because the initial doctor really made me think that there must not be something wrong and I'm just like seeking out something and it really messed with my head like and it's so unfortunate because I know that there are so many other patients out there who I'm sure are undiagnosed with certain conditions, and it can really break your spirit to want to seek out additional opinions when you have one doctor who says like, "Oh no, there's nothing wrong," when, you really are living with disabling, debilitating symptoms every day. And so that really resonates with me. But after I saw the neurosurgeon and I scheduled my surgery, there were certainly times where I thought, maybe I need to cancel this surgery. Like maybe I don't have this. And it was just like an incidental finding. And,
Yeah,
I don't know.
we can do this to ourselves when we know, like, even though you're the one experiencing these things, you can actually convince yourself that you're not, or it's just like you're not experiencing it to the extent that you think you are. It's like, oh my gosh, how do we? But then the input that we're getting from other people is like sort of confirming that in certain ways. And it's like you can't help but question yourself.
And it highlights how impactful words can be and when you're hearing these certain opinions from people who you are meant to look up to and get advice from, it does inform how you make future decisions and just how you kind of view your situation as a whole. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that wasn't easy to go through, but the ways that you advocated for yourself in the midst of it. And I also view your social media as a way that you advocate, not only for yourself, but to also be a voice for other patients. It's really, it's important and it's a much needed skill for those of us with chronic conditions and complex conditions to be able to know how to advocate for yourself and what you need. But in that same sense, you've been involved with Miles for Hips, which is a hip dysplasia advocacy organization, and you contributed to their patient experience interviews, talking about the hip dysplasia experience, what it means to be a patient with hip dysplasia, and you've also been involved in their Day of Movement, which happens every October and is a way to encourage the hip dysplasia community to move meaningfully, however that looks for them. But can you talk about what that event means to you in your hip dysplasia journey?
Love the concept behind the Miles for Hips Day of Movement and just the Miles for Hips in general, just like the meaning behind it, how the journey the journey with hip dysplasia is a marathon, not a sprint. Like it's, you're putting in a lot of miles dealing with something like this. But also the idea that like logging miles, like actual miles can be symbolic and can look different for everyone. So some people are actually, gonna be like running marathons, but other people like maybe their mile that day is just like getting up to go like to the bathroom or like getting a snack from the kitchen, and that's like what they can do on that day. And I think the meaning behind the Day of Movement for me is just celebrating, like whatever that movement is to you, however you can move your body, it still deserves to be celebrated. And I connect a lot to like when I was recovering from the PAOs, how another sort of benefit to having this very active presence on social media and doing these regular posts was I got to almost catalog what those recoveries were like and how things changed from week to week, and how like look at on day 5 I couldn't do this, but then on day 14 I was able to do it or whatever. And you kind of just see how your ability to move your body changes and increases with the process. And so yeah, I think the Day of Movement is such a good opportunity to highlight that. We're all over the world, we're all like experiencing hip dysplasia in our own ways, and we're all at different parts of our journey. And so movement looks different from one person to the next, but movement also looks different for the same person from 1 year to the next. And it's almost just like a nice mile marker to just like, every year come back to this moment where you're focusing on like, wow, what can I do with my body today to celebrate what it can do. And I think, for me personally in this hip journey, uh, I have learned a lot about how to find the joy in that and look at what is the movement that my body can do today, and how many things I've had to overcome in order for my body to do that movement today. And focusing on that instead of mourning all the ways that my body doesn't move like other people and I can't do things like other people can do. Like, I think it puts the emphasis on what can you do instead.
That's something that I've thought about too throughout my hip recoveries is not taking for granted the tasks that you once could do. So like going to the grocery store for the first time after a hip surgery, trying to like balance it all and just navigate life in a different way than you could before. I think those are things that should be celebrated, and I certainly learned to celebrate the first time that I got out of the house with crutches, or when I could wean down to one crutch instead of using two. And it feels very freeing and just gives you a different outlook on the special those more mundane moments can be. And I certainly found with my hip surgeon that he acknowledged that and he celebrated those what seemed like smaller moments for a person, but really when you go through such a life changing and life altering experience, it's not so small and it just really changes your outlook and being able to find joy in those moments. I found it to be really empowering and something that I have taken with me even after those surgeries and those experiences. Sometimes I'm walking outside in the winter and just like walking freely. I have a mobility device on my leg, but walking and just feeling the cold on my face. And it's like, wow, what a beautiful thing this is. And I don't know that I would feel that way if I haven't been through some of the things that I've been through?
Yeah, totally. I loved how you said it changed your perspective, because it really does. Like, it just, I mean, they always say, like, like you never know what you have until you don't have it anymore. And it's like all of a sudden, you end up, you know, with a broken pelvis and suddenly I mean, like previous to this surgery, you would have been having pain anyway and dysfunction. But it's like when you come out of the surgery, you basically have to rebuild everything from the ground up. And then it's like every little win along the way, like at the beginning, it's those mundane things that, like just being able to do laundry, or, yeah, like just go out for a walk or go shopping. Like, you can't do those things. And those, you know, kind of those things that you at one point in your life just did totally unconsciously without even thinking about it, or maybe even like begrudgingly, like, oh, I gotta go to the store, oh, I gotta like put a load of laundry in. And then all of a sudden now it's like, I can't wait till I can do those things again. It really does change your entire perspective.
It's so true. And it goes back to how you mentioned with the day of movement and just celebrating the ways that you are able to move, no matter what that looks like. I think that's a beautiful thing. So, um, that brings us to the end of the episode, but this has been it's been a pleasure talking with you, Heather. And where can listeners find you? And is there anything you're working on now that you want to share about or that you might have going on in the future?
Yeah, so if you're looking to follow my story and find me on social media, I'm at Heather Gets Hip Surgery, and each word is separated by an underscore. So at Heather underscore Gets underscore Hip underscore Surgery, and that's where I am on Instagram, and that's where I'm posting about my journey. And yeah, as far as things that I'm working on, I guess I'm just at this point I'm working on getting my legs fixed. So there'll be a lot of posts about my upcoming ortho surgeries. But I am also trying to help patients, especially with miserable malalignment syndrome, in a more meaningful way. I think with hip dysplasia, there's Miles for Hips is a very powerful patient advocacy group, and there's a lot of resources there, but there's not as much out there about miserable malalignment syndrome. And so I think it's harder. I found it really difficult when I knew what my diagnosis was, but I had a hard time finding surgeons who could treat this disorder. And if you go online and you search for miserable malalignment surgeon, you're not gonna come up with a lot of hits. And so I've been working with somebody else actually that you've interviewed on this podcast, Kate Williams. She and I have partnered together, and we're working on building and maintaining like a database of miserable malalignment surgeons, both in the US and around the globe. So these are, people with the title of lower limb lengthening and reconstruction, but I think it can be hard to find these people. So I guess that's something that I'm working on in terms of the advocacy space, is just helping patients who are not sure where to turn to when they're in pain and they need help, just being able to help connect them with the right kind of care.
That's great. And I will share your Instagram handle, and if the database is ready to share with others, or at a time when it does, I can certainly share that information as well, because knowing where to access care, specialized care, especially in this space of miserable malalignment, it's really important to get that awareness out there of who are the surgeons who can treat this appropriately. So that's a great initiative that you and Kate are working on, and much needed too, because like you said, in the hip dysplasia space, it's easy to go online and look for hip preservation programs, and there is a lot of information out there, but with miserable malalignment there is a lack of that information. So really
Yeah,
great that you're working to help to address that, and hopefully that can be a resource to patients, to other patients out there.
hoping I can help people. So, and it is ready. It's a link to a shared Google spreadsheet. So I can send you that link. And if anybody listening thinks that they might, need access to that information, you can also find me at Instagram and send me a message there, and I will send you the information that you need. So happy to help.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. This has been just an awesome conversation, and I hope that maybe we could connect around June is Hip Dysplasia Awareness Month. So I'd love to do more of a hip dysplasia focused episode and highlight the voices of those within the hip dysplasia community, and yours would be incredibly insightful to contribute to that.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it.